Hardly a day goes by that I don't hear or see in some form somebody or something that emphasizes the lowering of moral standards and values in our culture and in our society, coupled with religious freedoms being every year on a downward slide in our culture and society. In fact, next week I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes or so of the lesson giving you specific examples that are pretty unbelievable, pretty remarkable about religious freedoms that have actually been under assault over the last few years. And so since that's the case, and I think we all know that and all recognize that and agree with this, I want to start tonight by sharing with you an observation by author Eugene Peterson. Eugene Peterson wrote a best-selling book about 30 years ago called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. That was a very important book to me. He also was the translator of the Message. So everything you read in the Bible paraphrase, the Message, is the work in some way or another of Eugene Peterson. Here's what he wrote. 1,800 years or so of Hebrew history, capped by full exposition in Jesus Christ, tell us that God's revelation of himself is rejected far more than it is accepted. It's dismissed by far more people than who ever embrace it. And it's either been attacked or ignored by every major culture or civilization in which it has given its witness. Magnificent Egypt, fierce Assyria, beautiful Babylon, artistic Greece, political Rome, Enlightenment France, Nazi Germany, Renaissance Italy, Marxist Russia, Maoist China, and now Pursuit of Happiness America. The community of God's people has survived in all these cultures and civilizations, but always as a minority, always marginal to the mainstream, and never statistically significant. So what many of us think has been slowly happening in America, the frog slowly boiling to death in the kettle, is nothing that hasn't occurred in all cultures at one time or another. It wasn't just Daniel in Babylon, nor is it just you in your office or your neighborhood or the environment you're in. More often than not, Christians have been in the minority. Probably been that way in America too, at least true believers, through the existence of America. It's probably also been that way here. It's just that the culture, for the culture's own purposes, was more friendly to the values during that particular time period. Now it's not. That's pretty clear. It's not in government. It's not in public education. It's not in business. It's not anywhere. That's pretty obvious. And so what we've been doing over these weeks is talking about how do we deal with that when we are outnumbered, when true believers are a minority. And we've been looking mostly in the book of Daniel because that's exactly what happened to Daniel and his three Hebrew friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so as we begin tonight, I want to share with you three truths to always keep in mind when we are a minority, because it's easy for us to forget this. And the first is, God is in charge. You can write that principle down in your mind, and in every culture I just read about, from the words of Eugene Peterson, they have learned that. History has taught them. God is sovereign. God is in charge. History has taught them the truth of Solomon's words. The king's heart is like a stream of water directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he pleases. Rulers are often proud and hard and stubborn, but God knows how to turn hearts his way. Benjamin Franklin one time put it this way: the greatest monarch on the proudest throne is obliged to sit on his own rear end. Except he didn't use rear end. I inserted that word. He used a different word. Later on, DeMonte said, on the highest throne in the world, we still sit only on our own bottom. The greatest world leaders ever, including Nebuchadnezzar, in the marvelous empire of Babylon, learned that. Last week, we finished up in chapter 4, watching how Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man in the world, the greatest ruler in the world, when he sinned against God and God had had enough, wound up like an animal crawling around on the ground, driven from human society, eating grass like a cow, being drenched with the dew of heaven, living this way for 7 long years until his hair was as long as eagle's feathers and his nails were like bird's claws, until he came to his senses. And he said, my sanity returned, and I praised and worshiped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. I would remind you what I told you last week. Daniel chapter 4 is unique in the sense of it is entirely the words of Nebuchadnezzar himself, a Babylonian king, and what he learned as a result of his disobedience to God. He learned what I just told you. God is in control. God is sovereign. He is the Most High and honored, the one who lives forever. His rule is everlasting. His kingdom is eternal. All the people of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, what do you mean by doing these things? When my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and my glory and my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom with even greater honor than before. But what he had to go through to get there. 1998, the largest grossing movie of all time was released, and that is the Titanic, the story of the Titanic, which is a true story. On April the 4th, 1912, the unsinkable Titanic was surging across a calm sea, all speed full ahead. Looked like it was going to be that luxurious ship's first trip. And we all know what happened. She sank after glancing off an iceberg, but the most incredible part is what we learned afterwards in the investigation, and that is ship after ship after ship had warned them and sent messages to them and radioed them that there were icebergs in the area and that they had been dodging them and had almost hit one themselves. One of the people in the control room with the radio system was literally on the wire with Cape Race in Newfoundland, where the Titanic was supposed to dock, making arrangements for the passengers with their chauffeurs and their hotel concierges, and to make sure that their luxuries continued the minute they hit the dock. and actually said to some of the messengers who were wiring them messages, "Stop messaging us, leave us alone." Because they thought they were on an unsinkable ship. They ignored the warnings, repeated warnings. Some things are just too important to ignore. Thank God Nebuchadnezzar finally learned that. And the beautiful hanging gardens that he built for his wife are no longer there. They're gone. And all of the glory of ancient Babylon has been buried under the ruins many times and tells in what is now present-day Iraq. And all that is left of the glory of that place and that empire are the words we have of Nebuchadnezzar himself in Daniel chapter 4. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud. Don't ever forget that. No matter what happens in our culture, God is in control. There's a second important truth that I want you to remember before we dive into Daniel chapter 5. And that is that God's providence has throughout history put people in positions to have spiritual impact. We don't always realize it at the time. I cannot tell you how many instances I could give you of that in my own life. How many ways God has led or directed me in a situation that I didn't want to go or didn't think was the right route to go, and then later understood why. You have the same stories probably. I mean, we don't always realize that it's the Father's fingers around our lives, and He's the one helping us make strategic moves, but He is. Maybe there were days that Daniel moaned, "Lord, why am I here? My heart is in Jerusalem and not in this pagan place." But let me ask you a question. Did Daniel do more for the Lord in Babylon than he ever could have possibly done in Jerusalem? The answer to that is 1,000 times yes. Yes. He was just one man, but oh, the difference one man made. He would have been useful in Jerusalem, but in Babylon, God used him to steer worldwide events that we're still talking about in 2021, nearly 3,000 years later. Amazing how God's providence is able to do that. If we can only just believe it and see it. The power of one. We just observed a holiday last week that emphasizes to us the power of one person. What if Martin Luther King Jr. had taken a different route? What if he'd taken a different route from peaceful protest? It's possible our nation would have the same history many other divided nations have had when they've gone through some sort of civil war. It's possible there would have been a recklessness, because I remember the 60s well. There could have been a recklessness that literally tore our country apart shred by shred. Power of one. Daniel reminds me of the power of just one. If you don't think there's power of just one, get one mosquito in your tent and see how you feel about that. You see, it's often not how many, but it's who we are and where we are placed that matters most. And as a true believer in this culture, you may be a minority. You may be a minority at home. I know people who are in our church. You may be a minority at work. You may be a minority at school or in your neighborhood, but that doesn't mean God won't use you in a major way. And then the third truth that I want to point out before we get into chapter 5 is this: God often uses his minority to speak his word and sound his warning. And particularly that last part, because most of us today do not want to sound his warning. Much easier for us to just be happy, positive, say only things that we think people will agree with. But over and over again in the book of Daniel, we see he's Johnny on the spot with God's interpretation of what's going on, with God's prophetic word. And that can be true of believers when we're in the minority. If we had to court the favor of the majority, we wouldn't do what we're doing. We would consult opinion polls, like many in our country do, and then tailor the message according to what the opinion is. But when you're in the minority from the start, you have to understand what conviction really means. Daniel wasn't trying to make points with the king. He wasn't with Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to see tonight he wasn't with the next two kings are to come either. He was a Hebrew biding his time in a strange land. And this is our culture. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. When I started preaching in the 70s, there was a black church I often preached in just outside of Chapel Hill. And they sang that song pretty well every time I was there because they believed it. This world wasn't their home. They really, really believed it. Must have been Daniel's campaign song too. This world is not our home. But while we are here, we are to speak to those around us the Word of God. We are to live out the Word of God, and we are to remind them of His warnings. So as we go into chapter 5, I was trying to illustrate what's in this chapter to come, because of all the chapters we've looked at so far in our study, this is the one that's probably the least known. And my mind wandered back to the beginning years of Monday Night Football in the 70s and the 80s. And there was a guy there named Dandy Don Meredith, who had been a quarterback, who every time, it became a cultural icon. It became a cultural thing, what he did. Every time when it was finally decided, whether it was with 5 seconds left or 5 minutes left, when he knew the game was over, it could have been 15 or 25 minutes left. When he knew the game was over, he always did this. Not going to play? There it is. The party is over. That's not going to play, so I'm going to sing it for you. Turn out the lights, the party's over. They say that all good things must end. Turn out the lights, the party's over. Anyway, that's what he would sing. How many of you remember that? How many of you wish I'd never done that? Raise your hand. Go ahead and raise your hand. But you knew when he started to sing, it's like they used to say, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. When he started to sing, it was over. Well, in Daniel chapter 5, 2,600 years ago, there was a party in Babylon, and God said, turn out the lights. The party's over. There's actually a whole lot of history behind this. Great deal of historical information about these times. In fact, particularly the Greek historian Herodotus writes about these events. He even gives us the exact date in the fall of the Babylonian Empire. It was October the 12th, 539 BC. When chapter 5 opens, Nebuchadnezzar, that we've been studying all these years in the first 4 chapters, has been dead now for about 25 years. And several of his relatives spent a few years on the throne of Babylon, and by now, Daniel is probably either in somewhere between his mid-70s and his mid-80s. And he's in semi-retirement. He's no longer a VIP because Nebuchadnezzar was the one that knew him, and Nebuchadnezzar's relatives did not know Daniel, and so Daniel's kind of off on the sideline. And one of Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-laws, and there were a bunch of them because he had a lot of wives and a lot of children, is the official king, and his name is Nabonidus. And Nabonidus has a son named Belshazzar, who then follows him as king. Now, Nabonidus was a wicked king and a shrewd king, but Belshazzar was even worse than his father. And as we get into Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar's the king. The mighty army of the Medes and Persians have captured all of the territory around Babylon except the city itself. But you remember I showed you last week the city had those thick double walls that were 90 feet high and 20 feet wide, double walls around it, and the city was well fortified, and the Euphrates River ran under the city. So they were able to plant crops, and they thought they thought they would be able to wait out the Medes and the Persians. They had their own food source, they had their own security, and Belshazzar says, we can wait them out 20 years. They're the ones that are going to starve to death outside the city. They're going to turn around and go back to their country. And so what he does, trying to convince the others who are the leaders in Babylon at the time that he is confident they can outweight the Medes and the Persians, is he throws a big feast for 1,000 of his nobles. And he drank wine with them. But watch what he's going to do next, because this is really, really bad. And this is what ticked God off. There's always a point in every one of these cultures where God gets ticked off. It's going to happen in ours too. While Belshazzar was drinking the wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver cups that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted to drink from them with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. So they brought these gold cups taken from the temple, from the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. While they drank from them, they praised their idols made of gold and silver and bronze and wood and stone. Suddenly, they saw the fingers of a human hand writing on the plaster wall of the king's palace near the lampstand. Can you imagine that? How would you like to be at a fine party of a king in a big banquet hall, and out of nowhere comes what appears to be a human hand writing on the wall? The king himself saw the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale with fright. His knees knocked together in fear, and his legs gave way beneath him. And he shouted for the enchanters and the astrologers and the fortune tellers to be brought before him. And he said to these wise men, you'd think these guys had learned, wouldn't you? Isn't this the 4th time during our study that they've brought these? Whoever can read this writing and tell me what it means will be dressed in purple robes of royal honor and will have a gold chain placed around his neck. He will become the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. That's some pretty high rewards. If anybody has any idea what it means, they can step forward. You know what? I think they did know what it means. They just didn't want to tell him. But when all the king's wise men had come in, none of them could read the writing or tell him what it meant. So the king grew even more alarmed, and his face turned pale, and his nobles too were shaken. Do you know why I think his nobles were shaken? Because I think they could read the words. And they knew what it meant. One Sunday, a preacher was attending a Bible study conference and was absent at church, so the secretary placed a note in the bulletin explaining his absence. And this is what she meant to type. She meant to type, "Our preacher is away at a study conference." But she left the Y out. And instead she typed in the bulletin, "Our preacher is away at a stud conference." But what makes that even better is what she typed right below it. "Please keep him in your prayers." Well, what happens here in our text is the Babylonian king Belshazzar hosts a stud party. Now, how we know that? All his wives and concubines were there. It was a drunken orgy. They got the sacred goblets out that God had reserved among his people for special occasions, but that Nebuchadnezzar had brought during the captivity, and they brought them in to this orgy and drank out of them. And there's a tipping point with God. All through the Bible, there is a tipping point with God. All through history, there is a tipping point with God. This was the tipping point with God. Think about, and add insult to injury, using God's stuff to toast the gods of gold and silver and wood and stone. Belshazzar was really just spitting in God's face. Listen, that's never a good thing to do. Bothers some of us, the language that people use today about God. Bothers us, should bother us. But I know who gets the final say. I know that. And so suddenly, out of nowhere, comes this hand appearing out of thin air, writing words on the wall of the great banquet hall. And according to the text, if you'd been there, you would have thought the king was having a heart attack. His face was ashen, his body starts shaking, his knees start knocking. Because deep down in his heart of hearts, he knew what was happening. Everybody there recognized this ain't normal. Something supernatural's happening. God is crashing the party and saying, turn out, I'm not going to do it again. Turn out the lights. The party's over. And boy, was it. Now, can you imagine the scene? Immediately, he calls all his wisest men to the banquet hall. What do these words on the wall mean? 3 simple words in Aramaic. Anybody could read them, but what did they mean? And once again, the experts, the wise men, the magicians, the sorcerers are unable to say why. And then the queen mother, which probably was the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the younger wives of Nebuchadnezzar, heard what was happening. The reason we think that is she would have been the grandmother, you see, of Belshazzar. When the queen mother heard what was happening, she hurried to the banquet hall and said to Belshazzar, "Long live the king. Don't be so pale and frightened. There's a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insight and understanding and wisdom like that of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief over all the magicians and enchanters and astrologers and fortune tellers of Babylon. This man Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, has exceptional ability and is filled with divine knowledge and understanding. He can interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel and he will tell you what the writing means. Now remember what I told you earlier, Daniel's now in semi-retirement. When we're introduced to Daniel, as we were looking at in chapters 1 and 2, he was 16, 17, 18 years old. It's now 60 years or so have passed. He's in his mid to late 70s, maybe even his early 80s. And so Daniel gets brought to the party. Now he's an old man. And immediately Belshazzar promises him a purple robe and a gold chain and a big promotion as rewards for revealing the mystery. And I love Daniel's reply. He could care absolutely less about the king's wealth. And the promise of promotion in Belshazzar's government, he knew, was the equivalent of being offered to be captain of the Titanic when it was halfway across the Atlantic. And so he says to the king, you can keep your gifts, or you can give them to somebody else. I don't want them. He's unimpressed. But he says, I will tell you what the writing means. Because in the writing, just like 2 times before that Daniel has done this, Daniel is speaking only for God. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave sovereignty, majesty, glory, and honor to your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar. He made him so great that people of all races and nations and languages trembled before him in fear. He killed those he wanted to kill and spared those he wanted to spare. He honored those he wanted to honor and disgraced those he wanted to disgrace. But when his heart and mind were puffed up with arrogance, he was brought down from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven from human society. He was given the mind of a wild animal, and he lived among the wild donkeys. He ate grass like a cow. He was drenched until the dew of heaven. And he learned that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of the world and appoints anyone he desires to rule over them. Boy, we've heard that before, haven't we? You are his successor, O Belshazzar, and you knew all this, yet you still have not humbled yourself. For you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have had these cups from his temple. You remember when I said a moment ago there was a tipping point with God? Daniel here says, you were so proud that you had these cups from God's temple brought before you, and there was the tipping point. And you and your nobles and your wives and concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone, gods that neither see nor hear or know anything at all. You have not honored the God who gives you the breath of life and controls your destiny. So God has sent this hand to write this message. Boy, you're talking about not pulling any punches or mincing any words. That's what Daniel does. Now, verse 25 records the words the fingers of God wrote on the wall and their meanings. They were Aramaic terms, familiar to at least some of the wise men of Babylon. They had to have been. That's why I said a moment ago, I think they knew what the message said. They just didn't want to tell it. They were too afraid to confront the king. One meant numbered, another meant weighed, and another meant divided. Your days are numbered. God has weighed you in your kingdom, and now he is going to divide and conquer. And so historians tell us, not the Bible, not just the Bible, I should say, but historians tell us that very night, October the 12th, 539 BC, while Belshazzar was partying inside the city, while this very banquet was going on, And God showed up miraculously to write the message on the wall that very night. The Persian general Ugbaru was launching his attack. Ugbaru knew he couldn't go over 90-foot double walls, but why not go under them? And since the Euphrates River flowed below the city walls, his engineers went upstream and diverted the river into a basin. And that enabled his troops to march right into the city on dry ground. And the Medes and the Persians, just like that said, that very night, conquered the city of Babylon without a battle. And verse 30 says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed. Herodotus, a worldly historian, verifies that account. Then what happens? And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Well, we're out of time tonight, but Darius is going to become a central and key figure in what is going to happen next.